Hello everyone, and can I welcome you to the RF Museum's Research Lectures. I'm Dr. Harry Rafal, and it's a delight to have so many of you with us today for what I'm sure is going to be an excellent lecture. So can I welcome you from wherever you're joining us from? It's a global audience. We've got people joining from Seoul, Saskatoon, and even Milton Keynes. So wherever you're joining us from, I'm very grateful for you to be here, and I'm particularly grateful to be joined by today's speaker, who is Katharine Campbell. Dr. Campbell was a neuroscientist before becoming a writer, completing an MSc in Biomedical Sciences Research with distinction at King's College London, which must be awfully complicated because I can barely say it. That was followed by a PhD in neuroscience at University College London, where she worked as a postdoctoral fellow for many years on the development of pain processing in infants. She's always held a fascination in the first half of the 20th century, which was initiated by the stories she heard from her father, Sholto Douglas, the subject of today's lecture. Her biography of Douglas, Behold the Dark Grey Man, was published in 2021 and has been shortlisted for the 2018 Tony Leviathan Prize. She's written invited articles for Christ Church College, Oxford, the International Brigades Memorial Trust, 43 Fighter Squadron RAF, and the RAF Museum. She's collaborated with leading experts and historians across Europe and the UK, Australia, Netherlands, and the Netherlands on post-traumatic stress disorder. And in 2021, she was asked to participate in the Australian Royal Commission on Defence and Veteran Suicide. She has also campaigned for the charity Combat Stress. So a rich array of talents that Katharine holds, and I'm really looking forward to your lecture, Katharine. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to my lecture and to the RAF Museum for hosting me, particularly Dr. Rafal. I've got some very interesting photos to show for 45 minutes, but I'm not going to linger long over some of them because there's a lot to get through. So this is a whistle-stop tour of some interesting aspects of my father Sholto's life. Rather than concentrate initially on the events of Sholto's life in World War II that were and are sources of controversy for many, I intend to build a picture of the whole of his life in order to illustrate the reasons for his choices and also to demonstrate how a lifetime of traumatic events can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder becoming a whole body illness and not just a psychological one. And I witnessed its symptoms as a child. So I will also use insights from the scientific literature. In my book, Behold the Dark Grey Man, I don't attempt to evade the controversies, but analyse them fully, having examined thoroughly the original documents. So this introductory slide is my father just before the coronation in 1953. By that time, he was Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Douglas of Kirtleside. I'm going to start with his early life. He was born in 1893, and this period continues to the start of the First World War in 1914. So Sholto had a rather rough start in life, largely due to this guy, my grandfather, Robert Langton Douglas. This man started off as an Anglican clergyman, but by the end of his life, he had fathered 18 children with 3 wives and 5 mistresses. In 1900, he deserted his first wife, my grandmother Maggie, and their 3 children, Sholto and his 2 little brothers, aged 6, 5, and 3, and he went to Australia to take up a professorship at Adelaide University. He left them with nothing. The boys shared a bed. They had to move in with Maggie's parents, and they had no shoes for their feet at times. By 1905, unsurprisingly, Langton had left the church and was making money in art dealing because he was an art historian. He could afford to send his 3 sons to Tunbridge, but there wasn't enough money for them to board. This is a photograph of them in 1912. Sholto soon realized that his home circumstances were different from the other boys, and he said it was hard going having to be always on one's guard because they were much poorer, actually, than their school fellows. By 1927, though, only Sholto was alive. Archie at the back, his youngest brother, was joined the RFC and was shot down and killed in World War One. And Bobby, to the right of Sholto, after the war, joined the Indian Civil Service, and he died in 1926, probably of cholera. So I'm going to say a few words about childhood adversity. And Frederick Bartlett, who was the first professor of experimental psychology at Cambridge, said in his 1927 book, Psychology and the Soldier, an unusual degree of shyness or lack of sociability or secretiveness characterized people who'd had adverse circumstances in their childhood. And this was centered on the experience of being let down by somebody for whom he had a great respect or a great love. And obviously, in Sholto's case, this was his father. But Bartlett observed that these were predisposing factors in mental breakdown under the conditions of modern warfare. Bartlett was too ill to join up himself in the First World War, but he treated many soldiers who had broken down during World War One. And I found from reading the literature that some psychologists and psychiatrists who practiced in and after World War One, such as Bartlett himself and William Rivers, who treated Siegfried Sassoon, made more astute and humane observations than those that followed him. So we come to World War One. And after spending only 1 year at Oxford, starting in 1913, for attending which Sholto was awarded a scholarship, he enlisted at the beginning of World War I and was drafted into the Royal Horse Artillery. He joined the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, at the end of 1914 as an observer. And in that role, he pioneered aerial photography on the Western Front. He started training as a pilot in May 1915. And this is a photo of him in 1916, when he was the first commanding officer of number 43 Squadron at the age of 22. The squadron was stationed on an airfield at Raploch, just below Stirling Castle. It's now a council estate. And this photo of the castle and King's Park was taken in the 1900s, just before the start of World War I. The officers were billeted in Falloninch Farm. You can see the farm building on the left of the picture and the aircraft in the background, probably BE-2Cs, and the farmers' little children in the foreground. Sholto's time as commanding officer of number 43 was coloured by tragedy. This is his youngest brother, Archie, who had joined the RFC from the Royal Field Artillery in June 1916 and was posted to France as an observer in August. He was out on a reconnaissance mission with his pilot, Hugo, who actually had been with him at Tunbridge, when he was shot down by enemy anti-aircraft fire on the 16th of October. Sholto and Archie were very close to each other. Our family commemorated the centenary of his death in 2016, and here is his headstone in Russian Farm Military Cemetery near Armentières in northern France. I asked for the stone to be replaced following the commemoration, and this is a replaced stone because it had the wrong insignia on it, the RAF instead of the RFC, and of course the RAF was not formed until 1918. I also had engraved on the headstone, you can see at the bottom, 2 lines from Maurice Baring's poem In Memoriam A.H., composed in memory of Auberon Herbert, Captain Lord Lucas, also in the RFC, shot down just 2 weeks after Archie. And obviously it says, among the chosen few, among the very brave, the very true. The poet, Baring, was actually a personal staff officer to General Trenchard, as he was then. Sholto's grief was made so much worse by his mother's understandably distraught reaction to her son's death. And I think that Archie's death influenced everything in Sholto's life from that point onwards, including the tactical decisions that he made. And a photo of Archie was on his desk until the end of his life. And you can see that his mother fastened all the guilt onto Sholto for his brother's death. He may well have suffered from what the psychiatrist Marty Horowitz has called complicated grief disorder, which is made more likely by the unexpected or torturous death of a sibling or other family member, and also real or fantasized responsibility for the death itself, which obviously Sholto felt. So here is Sholto as CO of number 84 Squadron in 1918 in front of his favourite aircraft, the SE-5A. In the last month of the war, with the rapidity of the Allied advance, the army commander often lacked information concerning the position of his forward troops. It was then that Sholto came to the rescue with a novel form of low reconnaissance that exposed him to considerable danger from hostile ground fire, for which he was awarded the DFC. He had been awarded the MC in 1915, at the end of 1915, for his bravery in a dogfight with two German aces, Oswald Boelcke and Max Immelmann. At this point, the end of World War I want to say a few words about traumatic brain injury. Sholto suffered two instances of this in World War I, once when he had a very bad aircraft crash in May 1917, and the second time when he was knocked unconscious by his pilots. They assaulted him in 1918. The full story of both is told in my book. The important takeaway message from this is that this condition heightens the risk not only of developing PTSD, but also of dementia in later life, both of which happened with Sholto. I think this is very relevant to today, considering IED blast injuries in recent conflicts. In total, Sholto survived 4 serious air crashes, the last occurring just before the outbreak of war in World War II. So we come to the period of between the wars. After World War I, Sholto was posted to Cranwell to command 3 flying training schools. But he was so disillusioned and exhausted following the war that he left the RAF and decided to try commercial aviation, then in its infancy. He joined Handley Page's air transport company and applied for one of the new commercial pilot's licenses. He had wanted number 1, but due to an argument with his father, with whom he was staying, he ended up with license number 4. He made the first transport light flight from London to Manchester carrying 12 passengers, and the first commercial cross-channel flight to Brussels from the UK, transporting freight on charter, both in a Handley Page 0400. But commercial aviation soon lost its lustre too, and he gave up his job with the air transport company. He was like so many others who had served in World War I and described the problem very eloquently himself. He said, "We who had participated so actively and so eagerly in the war over such a long period of time had been subjected to an overstimulation that was now exacting its toll, and in many different ways we were run down to a state that approached a standstill." He was also unemployed at this point and desperately short of money. and an extra complication was that he had just got married. He thought about joining his father in the art business and spent some time studying art in the Netherlands. He also thought about joining one of J.P. Morgan's companies. Morgan was one of his father's clients, but this also never transpired. So I studied what psychiatric help was available at the end of World War I. And actually, there was precious little. Abram Gardner was an eminent psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who worked with US veterans in the 1920s and 1930s. And he wrote in his seminal work, The Traumatic Neuroses of War, published in 1941, that after World War I, there was no systematic regime or machinery for the treatment of those suffering from traumatic neuroses. And many received no treatment until 3 to 5 years after the original trauma. I think he published his book actually in 1941 because he realized that the lessons from World War I were not being learnt. And there were lots of people at the end of World War I, like Sholto, who didn't appear to be suffering from any kind of psychiatric condition, but the trauma was bubbling under the surface. And Graves and Hodge, who wrote a wonderful book called The Long Weekend, A Social History of Great Britain, 1918 to 1939. It was published in 1940. Said that after World War I, in most cases the blood was not running pure again for 4 or 5 years. And in numerous cases, men who had managed to avoid a nervous breakdown during the war collapsed badly in 1921 or 1922. But then, at the beginning of 1920, Sholto met Sir Hugh Trenchard, then Chief of the Air Staff, just by chance on the steps of the Bath Club. And Trenchard persuaded him to rejoin the RAF. It was just a chance meeting, but actually it set the whole course of Sholto's life from that time forward. From there, Sholto started to climb the RAF ladder, spending time on the staff of No. 1 Group at Kenley, commanded by Group Captain Dowding, as he was then. After Sholto attended the first Staff College course in 1922 and the first course at the Imperial Defence College in 1927, he was due for an overseas posting, which was to Khartoum from 1929 to 1931. Sholto commanded No. 47 Squadron, and you can see the float planes on the Nile in the background, and also his pet lion cub, Belinda, just to the left of Sholto. All I can say at this point, actually, is at least Sholto wasn't the person holding the tail. Belinda unfortunately finished her RAF career due to attacking the camp doctor's backside and drawing blood, and was found with her paws on the bed of the little girl in the garden next door, purring loudly while the little girl screamed. Unfortunately, she'd found her way through the fence and into the back garden of the house next door. On a more serious note, the situation in Sudan actually highlighted some similar issues to today. How do you deploy air power versus boots on the ground? In that situation, Sholto championed air power because he deemed it actually caused less loss of life than boots on the ground at that point. At the beginning of World War II, Sholto was Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, and in April 1940 he was made Deputy Chief of the Air Staff. He was involved in numerous controversies in World War II, and these are fully covered in my book. I don't wish to spend a lot of time on these, but the main ones were that during actually the Battle of Britain, he didn't seem to appreciate the seriousness of the pilot shortages, and Dowding had to call a meeting at Bentley Priory to inform Sholto of how bad the shortages were. And also the other big controversy in which he was involved was the big wing, although it was mainly Bader and Lee Mallory who championed the use of this formation. He also was controversial, Sholto was controversial in his use of fighter sweeps over France after the end of the Battle of Britain. What I want to say is that a cumulative burden of trauma causes a deterioration in executive functioning and some bad decision making. And really, there's no doubt that Sholto did make some bad decisions. He did also make some good ones, but there were some bad ones. Executive function is a set of mental skills that include working memory, flexible thinking, and self-control. And we use these skills every day to learn, work, and manage daily life. Trouble with executive function can make it hard to focus, prioritize, and handle emotions, among other things. And Sholto's thinking was influenced by his experiences of big wing formations in World War One. And he demonstrated a certain inflexibility in his thinking. But he also wanted to prevent pilot losses with large formations. And I think he was thinking about Archie and others in World War One. And Archie was shot down when his aircraft was on reconnaissance with only one other aircraft. What Dowding said about the wings in particular was that they were out of date and a retrograde step, especially in the Battle of Britain. Dowding said that fighter operations in World War One, in which wing formations were used, were quite different because they were freebooting expeditions further away over enemy territory, whereas the flying practice by pilots in fighter command in 1940 was much more disciplined with stricter ground-to-air control. And this was actually impossible when you were operating a big wing, because each of the squadrons in the wing operated on different frequencies, and at times the pilots could not even talk to each other. Sholto has been accused many times of being instrumental in ousting Dowding and Park from their respective roles of Air Officer Commander-in-Chief Fighter Command and Air Officer Commanding Number 11 Group. But in fact, at the end of the Battle of Britain, Dowding had many other forces arrayed against him, including Lord Beaverbrook, the former Chiefs of the Air Staff, Trenchard and Salmond, and others on the air staff who thought he should go. He had actually been due to retire earlier, and a year earlier. And the final straw was the bombing of Coventry on the 14th of November 1940, when the German bombers got through and Fighter Command failed to make a single interception to stop them. This is what Dennis Richards, a famous historian who wrote a beautiful biography of Portal, and also who wrote with Hilary St. George Saunders the official history of the RAF in World War II. This is what Dennis Richards said about Sholto. It was ridiculous to present Douglas as just a schemer. He might have been a bit of that, but he was a very clever man and a good commander. He might have had ambitions, but he was basically concerned with the problem of night defence. This big wing affair had been blown up out of all proportion. And this was said in a symposium on the Battle of Britain on its 50th anniversary in 1990. So Sholto took over from Dowding as C&C Fighter Command on the 25th of November 1940. He set to work straight away on the problem which troubled him most, which was that of night air defence. And obviously this is a photo of the star night fighter pilot, among others, John Cunningham. Over the next few months, distinct progress was made in ground control interception and airborne interception radar, in which Sholto had a bigger hand than many people realise. He cooperated with Tizard and others, and this culminated in what Sholto called a command performance on the 7th of May 1941. I'm actually writing an article about Sholto's part in the development and application of radar. Anyway, on that night, on the 7th of May, number 604 Squadron was deployed to intercept German night bombers. And among the pilots were John Cunningham with his radar operator, Jimmy Rawnsley. King George VI had actually asked to see 604 Squadron in operation, and he and Sholto and the station commander, Group Captain William Elliott, drove to Middle Wallop, where they met air crews prior to the night's operations. They drove down to a radar station at Sopley in Hampshire, which was commanded by Squadron Leader J.L. Brown, and he was as much of a genius with ground control interception radar as Jimmy Rawnsley was with airborne interception radar. So they actually witnessed on the radar screen, but then actually saw outside the radar station Cunningham and Rawnsley shoot down a German night bomber. So the King and Sholto and Elliott drove back to Middle Wallop and met Cunningham, and this photo is a record of that. Sholto can be seen just in the background, his face is in the background. This is the officers' mess at Middle Wallop, and this photo is hanging in the officers' mess there to this day, along with the story. One problem of which Jimmy Rawnsley himself was well aware, and to which he referred, was the whole problem of operational stress, which led to breakdown in some cases, and what Rawnsley referred to as the twitch at the end of this quote. He said, however slight the strain, and no matter how long it took to build up, it was there as a very natural revolt of the human system against repeated exposure to risk. And Rawnsley knew a lot about that. It was there inside each one of us, a secret enemy within. I felt that it was as if each of us started with a certain capital which we spent. But when it was gone, life became a torment, with the spirit flogging on a bankrupt body. That was what we called the twitch. In order to compel air crews to undertake hazardous missions, the Air Ministry introduced the term lack of moral fibre, or LMF, as a punitive sanction. This egregious classification started as a result of bomber operations in 1939 by Wellington's of No. 5 Group, in which there was a 50% attrition rate. And it was introduced officially in the Waverer letter written by Charles Evans, who was the Principal Assistant Secretary for Personnel at the Air Ministry in April 1940. And the definition of LMF was members of air crews in operational units whose conduct may cause them to forfeit the confidence of their commanding officers in their determination and reliability in the face of danger. The problem was that there was a difficulty distinguishing between LMF and anxiety neurosis, which was the commonest disorder. There was a 1944 study which examined the reliability of psychiatric opinion in the RAF and compared the views of two psychiatrists in their diagnoses. The two psychiatrists agreed 44% of the time if the initial diagnosis was LMF, But if the initial diagnosis was anxiety neurosis, they agreed 88% of the time. So that you can see that there was a grey area in this whole LMF classification where it was actually difficult to determine whether the person was suffering LMF or something else. They said that in the same study, they said that in 76% of cases of psychological disorder, flying duties rather than temperament had been a factor. And their views on flying duties versus temperament counter the tendency of governments and organizations, and this has happened at least since World War I, to blame the individual for his or her breakdown, rather than to accept accountability themselves for sending people to war. This is a very serious problem, and it happens today. So the prevalence of LMF was 300 to 400 cases per year, and of neurosis nearly 3,000 per year during World War II. But this is probably a gross underestimate due to fear and stigma, which prevented people from coming forward if they thought they had a problem. So Bomber Command and Flying Training Command were the most affected, and pilots comprised 50% of cases of neurosis, mostly among officers. Sholto proposed, he said that the best criterion for deciding when pilots and air crews should be rested is the number of hours of operational flying performed. He proposed 200 hours for those in fighter command. But Sir Frederick Bohill, at that time C&C Coastal Command, wanted greater variation in the length of tour because of the wide varieties of tasks the crews in Coastal Command had to perform. But for Sholto, it was 200 hours. Sholto's next posting was in January 1943, when he became C&C Middle East Command, based in Cairo. This is Sholto looking at operational photos with stereoscopic glasses out in Cairo. The command was known as Muddle East before Sholto got there, but similarly to his stance in every other senior post he had held, Sholto was concerned with making sure that pilots were trained properly by building up operational training units, or OTUs. And actually, this was a powerful way of addressing problems with LMF or anxiety neurosis. The problems could be, of course, mitigated by adequate training. He revamped the entire training organization in the Middle East, involving not only operational training, but also a big increase in armament, signals, and navigation instruction. Sholto was particularly concerned with fighter reconnaissance or army cooperation and general reconnaissance squadrons out in the Middle East due to the dangerous work that they had to perform. And I feel it's not inconceivable that Sholto had his brother Archie at the back of his mind. This is a photo of Sholto in 1943 with Monty on his right, General Jumbo Wilson, who was Sholto's army counterpart in Cairo, and Arthur Tedder. Despite Sholto's successes in reorganizing Middle East Command, this was one of the most troubled parts of his career, when I actually believe that he suffered betrayal-based moral injury, being let down by those he trusted. And as I've written on the slide, this involves moral transgression by a trusted other, potentially contradicting moral expectations about the goodness and dependability of others. And the occasions on which this might have happened for Sholto was firstly in the formation of Mediterranean Air Command, which actually happened shortly after Sholto was posted to Cairo. And I'll explain more about that in the next slide. And also Operation Accolade, which was the Churchill, the invasion of the Dodecanese islands of Rhodes, Scarpanto and others, which is what Churchill championed. And then also something that Sholto only found out about later, which was that Air Marshal Freeman was writing poisoned letters to the chief of the air staff, Portal, about Sholto. So this is what Tedder wrote in his own memoir about the formation of Mediterranean Air Command. Sholto had originally come out to Cairo to relieve me, but when I was called on to stay in the Mediterranean area and set up a superior headquarters, he was left in an invidious position. And Sholto only learned of the decision to form Mediterranean Air Command shortly after his arrival in Cairo. And in fact, Tedder engineered the formation of this command. He had been promoted to Air Chief Marshal on the same day as Sholto in July 1942, but now he stepped over Sholto. And there were some very awkward situations about this because Tedder started taking forces and equipment from Middle East Command without consulting Sholto, and Sholto was left to discover for himself that, both personnel and equipment had disappeared from his command and was being utilized by Mediterranean Air Command. Then there was Operation Accolade, the proposed invasion of the Dodecanese, as I said, when those in charge of the operation did not receive backup from Mediterranean Air Command or the Americans, and the operation failed. Sholto said that the Prime Minister, obviously Churchill, has told us to plan for the capture of Rhodes and Scarpanto with ingenuity and resource. I hope that this does not mean that we have got to do it on the cheap from the air point of view, but that is exactly what happened. Eisenhower thought that Accolade was a distraction from Operations Husky, the invasion of Sicily, and Avalanche, the invasion of Italy, and most of all, from planning for Overlord. Finally, Freeman's poisoned letters to Portal about Sholto, amongst others, because Freeman wrote poisoned letters about a lot of people, not just Sholto, to Portal, did affect the course of Sholto's career. The full story is told in my book. Nevertheless, Sholto was very popular with those who served under him in Middle East Command, and this photo was taken at Christmas in 1943. And this is Sholto with his crews, who the crews wanted him to sign their menu cards, and he was greatly loved, actually, by those who served under him. In January 1944, Sholto was appointed C-in-C of Coastal Command. And one of the unsung victories of World War II was that Coastal kept the channel free of enemy vessels so that the D-Day landings could take place. And the two in this picture were fundamental. Senior Naval Staff Officer Captain D.V. Peyton Ward and WAF Admin Officer Phyllis Davies. They tracked U-boats with incredible accuracy. Phyllis became a very great friend of mine, and sadly she died 3.5 weeks ago, aged nearly 102. But she actually told me a lot about my father when he was C-in-C Coastal Command, and I interviewed her for my book. In April 1945, the war was coming to an end, and this is Sholto at Coastal Command. And to his right is Harold Kirby, the Air Officer Administration at Coastal. And to his left is the CAS, Peter Portal. And on the extreme left is Aubrey Elwood, who is the Senior Air Staff Officer at Coastal Command. And Sholto had invited Portal to an evening to watch films of strike squadrons and have an evening really observing the work of Coastal Command. So the casualties among strike squadrons were among the highest in the war, largely because of the types of flying they were doing up the coast of Norway, attacking U-boats and their bases, as well as Nazi supply lines. Sholto pressed Portal for Mustang escorts for these squadrons, and when they were supplied eventually towards the end of the war, the attrition rate was reduced and lives were saved. In July 1945, Sholto was posted to Germany as the C&C, British Air Forces of Occupation. He was horrified by the destruction in Berlin and Warsaw, and in October 1945, he went to Warsaw to open an exhibition on the activities of the RAF there. He wrote to his father, "I think I bear my responsibilities lightly on the whole, but I have been under a continuous strain of responsibility for a long time. The result is that I am tired out. We live in an atmosphere of misery and starvation." As after the end of World War I, he desperately needed a rest, having had only 4 weeks' leave in the previous 6 years. And regarding misery and starvation, I think that's quite evident from this photo. In January 1946, Sholto was promoted to Marshal of the Royal Air Force and appointed military governor of the British zone of occupation in post-war Germany. He did not want the job, for which the first military governor, Monty, had recommended him, handing him in what was in effect a poisoned chalice. But the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, persuaded Sholto to take the job, and he took over officially in May. Monty didn't give Sholto a proper handover, and conditions were absolutely dire, as this photo shows. In March 1946, the daily food ration in Germany had been cut to 1,014 calories per day. In practice, many people received less than that and were on the edge of starvation. So this is Sholto pictured here with the three military governors of the other zones. So to his immediate left is General Joseph McNarney for the US, then General Pierre Koenig for France, and Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky of the USSR. Sholto's brief as military governor was very broad and included all aspects of life in the British zone: the health of the population, a part of which was the supply of medicines such as insulin and morphine, food and fuel supply, housing, education including denazification, intelligence information, local administration and politics, disarmament, reparations, displaced persons and refugees, and legal affairs, to name but a few. One of the things he did was speaking to German school children, and he's seen here at a school in Hamburg with Heinrich Landau on his right, who was the education senator for Hamburg and a member of the Social Democratic Party, or SPD. Landau had been anti-Nazi and was a very brave man during the period of the Nazis. The army officer on Sholto's left was Brigadier Armitage, who was then regional commissioner for Hamburg. I always think in this photo that with his crossed arms, Sholto actually looks more uncomfortable than the little boy in front of him. Sholto had to review the pleas for clemency for the major Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg, being the only one of the 4 military governors to take the task seriously and to do his research. The Americans wanted everything referred to the legal directorate, the French wanted to set up a commission, and the Russians wanted to reject all pleas for clemency and have everyone executed as soon as possible. He also had to make the final decisions about all the death sentences which were passed by the military government courts in the British zone, either confirming or commuting them as he saw fit. And there were hundreds of them. I'm going to read this little bit because it's important. These sentences ran all the way from more of the war criminals condemned to death to unfortunate displaced persons, among whom there were many Poles who had found ways of disposing of their hated German oppressors, to a Briton in the forces who had committed a murder such as strangling his German girlfriend. Up to that time, I had not given a great deal of thought to the problems of capital punishment, although I did have a definite antipathy towards it. But my personal experiences during my time in Germany changed that antipathy into a strong conviction that the death penalty should be abolished. So this is a death sentence. And the first time I saw my father's signature on a death warrant in the National Archives, I gasped. And in the ensuing 30 seconds, I felt all the emotions that my father must have done: horror, revulsion, guilt, shame, and even sympathy. It was overwhelming. I noticed that my father did not use his usual signature, W.S. Douglas or W.S.D., when signing these death warrants, but instead Sholto Douglas. Here was a human being fully engaged with this process and not distancing himself from the distressing task at hand. Whatever they had done, these people were fellow human beings, and they deserved the full consideration of another sentient person, not a figurehead. And you could be sentenced to death for something such as unauthorized use of a firearm, because firearms obviously were very common immediately in post-war Germany, and people got hold of them and committed crimes. And it seems harsh now that some people were executed for the unauthorized use of a firearm, even if they didn't necessarily commit murder. So, for comparison, I decided to look at Monty's signature on a death warrant that he had signed previously while military governor. And there it was, written in his childlike hand, almost printed, Montgomery of Alamein. By contrast with Sholto, I felt that here was a man who seems to have concealed himself behind his position. And I suspected that there were no troubling thoughts of guilt and revulsion for him at the end of his life, like there were for Sholto. So we come to perpetration-based moral injury. This is what troubled my father most, and it was evident to those who worked with him, including Lord Pakenham. When as a child I witnessed the florid manifestations of PTSD at the end of his life, of Sholto's life, it was not World War I combat or events in World War II that he relived during the night in his nightmares and sleepwalking episodes, but it was his time signing death warrants in post-war Germany. He said it was by far the most distressing part of my work while I was in Germany, and it rested in the many death sentences with which I had to deal. And there is in my memory a deep scar from that odious experience of having to deal with hundreds of these cases. And Pakenham wrote, and in every good sense of the word, he is so completely human that many features of the occupation life caused him distress, the semi-starvation, the bitterness it generated, and to mention only one other thing, the number of death warrants he had to sign. This may surprise you, But it is what the person who is probably the leading expert on moral injury in the world, Professor Brett Litz, has discerned in his many studies involving armed forces personnel from more recent conflicts. Moral injury is not officially classified as a mental disorder in the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5. But as studies have shown, and as Professor Litz has said, it is the best predictor of the prototypical re-experiencing symptoms of PTSD. So I just want to have a summary slide of the experiences of Sholto's life that were predictive of PTSD. Starting with childhood adversity, the desertion by his father and poverty, the traumatic death of a beloved sibling, Archie, and of comrades, combat trauma of long duration in World War I, first in the RHA and then in the RFC and RAF, including facing death many times through combat, traumatic brain injury, his aircraft accident and the assault by his pilots, lack of social support between the wars, continual repression, this is unconscious, and suppression, conscious, of traumatic memories and emotional numbing, multiple deaths of subordinates in World War II, and betrayal and perpetration-based moral injury, Middle East, and signing the death warrants. So we come to PTSD as a whole body condition. Some of the symptoms you know, and some you might not have considered. The flashbacks, nightmares, sleepwalking episodes, outbursts of anger and physical violence, overindulgence in alcohol, tobacco and food, weight gain, especially around the waist. We're coming to the more unusual ones. Metabolic syndrome, that is weight gain plus raised blood pressure, high blood sugar and abnormal cholesterol levels, sleep disturbances, stroke, coronary artery disease, and finally dementia. But I quote here a study, a focus group study of veterans who were supposed to be suffering from dementia. And the findings from the study were encouraging, because the investigators found that when they addressed the symptoms such as confusion, concentration problems, memory, and functional impairment, when they addressed all those symptoms by treating the trauma, they actually disappeared. This is a study which I feel is actually more optimistic than many. And I'm going to quote from that study. Older trauma survivors run the risk of being misdiagnosed with dementing processes, underscoring the potential for inappropriate medical and psychiatric treatment and the further loss of autonomy. In addition, even though there is little doubt that some elderly survivors' increased distress and trauma-related symptoms are triggered by cognitive decline and dysfunction, the importance of investigating the phenomenology of their distress and finding ways of easing it remains. In other words, regardless of etiology or cause, it is of value to learn more about late onset stress, if it can potentially lead to greater understanding of the phenomenon and to the alleviation of suffering. I wish that those providing medical care for Sholto had known this at the time. It would have prevented a whole load of suffering. This is a photo of Sholto as I remember him. He had a very successful post-service career as chairman of BEA until his physical and mental health deteriorated. The full story of Sholto's life and the issues that it raises is told in my book, Behold the Dark Grey Man, published last year by Biteback Publishing. So I've reached the end of my presentation, and thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, Catherine, thank you very much. That was great. I'm just going to close your slides so that you can rejoin us when you're ready.
Yeah.
Before we kick into the Q&A, it's a good opportunity to invite our audience first to submit any questions they have using the Ask a Question function, and secondly to tell them that next week on Monday and Tuesday we have our annual conference, which will begin at 9:30 on the 5th of September, running through to about 5 o'clock. And then again on the 6th of September, it will kick off at 9:30. And we have a whole program of fantastic interdisciplinary research. And I think that's a really nice point to kick into our Q&A, Catherine, because I think that's what's been so great about having you come and join us. And what's so interesting about your book is that it draws out themes we might not necessarily tend to observe because of your own background. And of course, the insights you're able to provide on Douglas from your own experiences. I mean, do you find that he's a sort of an underrepresented figure, partly because he does conceal his sort of personal characteristics so much?
Yes, I really think that is true. I mean, people tend to think of him as a very determined leader, but also, and I say this in the book, he was also a diffident man. There was a remoteness and a shyness about him. And I think it was because he had so many issues bubbling under the surface. And he was not he didn't court the media. He was not a convinced self-publicist. And it may have been because of this psychological burden that he was carrying.
Yeah, I think that's interesting in comparison to say Joubert de la Ferte, who's the first sort of CNC properly of Coastal Command, who's a real publicist. And
Yeah.
there is a lot of advertising around Coastal Command at various points in the war. Did he
Yeah.
have to engage with that?
Oh, well, the thing was that he did, because in fact he got very upset, and in my book there is a record of this, but I looked also at a lot of documents from the time, from Coastal Command and from the Admiralty, because Sholto felt that the work of Coastal Command was underrepresented, and he tried very hard to increase the coverage of Coastal Command because they did heroic work. And their victories, really, like for example keeping the channel free of U-boats, which was during the D-Day landings, which was an amazing undertaking. And many people don't actually know about that, and they know a bit about the Battle of the Atlantic, but they don't know about the Coastal's role during the D-Day landings, and they don't know about the heroic work that Coastal did up the coast of Norway, when their losses were extremely severe. But they were doing amazing flying up Norwegian fjords, and with a lot of hostile fire. And I just feel and I'm sure actually Dr. Christina Gulter, who's written the most wonderful book on Coastal Command, I'm sure would agree that Coastal Command is very much underrepresented even today.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting the heavy losses that the strike squadrons had experienced, because I knew about that, but I hadn't connected it quite so much with Douglas's period of command, because of
Yeah.
course he also has to command fighter command when it's going over to France, and again he gets a lot of criticism about losses.
Yes. I mean, actually, I think he actually commanded the various commands at their most difficult time. Vincent Orange said that he commanded them when the glory days of each command, if you like, had passed. So, Fighter Command after the Battle of Britain, Middle East Command after El Alamein, Coastal Command after the Battle of the Atlantic had been won, and British Air Forces of occupation at an extremely difficult time in post-war Germany. So I feel that he took over his various commands at their most difficult points. And yes, in Fighter Command and in Coastal Command, certainly there were very heavy losses.
Okay, we've got some questions from our audience, so I'm going to begin with this one from Johnny Doyle, who asks a rather simple question, but it might be a complicated one to answer, which is, did...
I'm still seeing my slides. I'm not.
No, no, we're just seeing yourself and me. So if you want to close your slide deck down, you'll be able to come into Crowdcast and see us.
Oh, okay. The
Yes.
only thing is, slideshow, click to exit. Okay, brilliant.
Okay, so you'll have the joy of seeing me again. That's fantastic.
Yeah, great, lovely, reassuring.
Excellent. Yes. So the question we have is from Johnny, who asks, did Douglas meet his father again when they were both in Ireland in 1917?
Oh yes, absolutely, he did. That I think that Mr. Doyle must have read my book, because yes, Sholto, after he'd had his aircraft accident in 1917, he went across to Ireland to see his father, who at that time was director of the National Gallery of Ireland. And the thing about Sholto and his father, and I suspect Mr. Doyle may be Irish, I don't know, but the thing about Sholto and his father was that they were very pro-Irish independence. And in part, Sholto's father was chosen to be director of the National Gallery because it was thought that he would get along well with the Irish people. And he oversaw the directorate, the National Gallery, in the transition to independence, because he was there until 1922.
That's interesting. I hadn't realised that he was pro-Irish independence.
I've just got to say something else about Sholto and Ireland. I must just say this. Sholto was actually sent by the RFC to choose all the sites for aerodromes on the island of Ireland. He actually chose all the aerodromes, and today all the famous aerodromes, Aldergrove, Belfast, Collinstown, Dublin, and the main military airfield at Baldonnel, they are all on sites chosen by Sholto. And it's a very nice story, and it's in my book.
Good. We like the plugs. We're going to share links for everyone who's watching. We're going to share some links at the end so that they can find their way through to both the publisher's site and a commercial seller of the book as well. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to know that he was pro-Irish independence, because there's an emerging sort of field of research looking at how Britain and Ireland sort of engaged with each other during this period. And we had Joseph Quinn speaking on this earlier this year. So yeah, I mean, how did that go into the interwar period, where with Douglas's sort of politics as well post-war, because he goes into the House of Lords, of course.
Well, post World War II, he sat on the Labour benches in the House of Lords, and in fact, this, I mean, in some ways it looks like a contradiction, but actually, if you knew him, it wasn't a contradiction. He was a lifelong socialist, partly because he grew up he spent part of his childhood in very impoverished circumstances. And he wrote himself that he realized that opportunities for people were by no means equal, and it infuriated him. He did not wish to become an MP, but one way that he could engage with the political process was to become a member of the House of Lords, which he did, and he sat on the Labour benches. He had very close links when he was chairman of BEA with Ireland and with his counterpart, Dr. Jerry Dempsey in Aer Lingus. And Sholto he was on the board of Aer Lingus, and he used to go to Ireland at least once a month for a board meeting, an Aer Lingus board meeting. So he kept in touch with Ireland right the way through. And I believe, and this is a contentious thing to say, I believe that he thought partition was a mistake. The partition, the hiving off of Northern Ireland was a mistake.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Russell, which I think I'm going to put to you. I think I know from our previous conversation about Arrow Barrow that I think you'll enjoy talking about it. So Russell says, great presentation. Sholto once had the future inaugural Prime Minister of Barbados,
Yes.
Flying Officer Errol Barrow, as his personal
Yeah.
navigator
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
the war. Did he talk about him at all?
Oh, not only did he talk about him, our lives were absolutely intertwined with Errol Barrow's. So basically, um, after my father had his first stroke in 1962, Errol, with whom he'd kept in touch, invited my father and my mother and I out to Barbados, and we went out there. We spent a lot of time, and up until Sholto died, actually, from 1962 until 1969, out in Barbados. My parents built a house out there. We were there when Errol became the first Premier of Barbados, and we were there when he became the first Prime Minister. And there's a photo of Errol and my father in my book, of them listening intently to each other. We were very, very fond of Errol, and Errol's views politically chimed very much with my father's. They were on the same side of politics, and they used to have endless, actually not acrimonious discussions, but harmonious discussions. Really quite wonderful. And after my father died, Errol wanted to be known as my godfather, and he really sort of took care of me a bit after my father died. Whenever we went to Barbados, he took me riding. It was absolutely wonderful, and he, along with my father, um, imbued social values in me. You know, he was a very I can't think of the word now, but you know, he was a very upright man in many ways, and I learned from him and from my father.
Yeah, he's got some fantastic speeches, Errol Barrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a question here from Ronnie Fraser, which I think you might not be able to answer, but I think it's interesting. So I'm gonna read it out for you. Which is Ronnie's researching the life of Lieutenant A. Robinson, a balloon observer who was attached to number 3 section. At 6:30 p.m. on the 8th of August 1918, he went aloft in a balloon over no man's land near Harbour, somewhere in France. I'm going to say,
Yeah.
because I can't. People will know if they watch it regularly. I can't pronounce foreign words at all. I'm afraid. Which was shot down 2 hours later by friendly fire. Robinson successfully parachuted to the ground. The Wing HQ later identified the culprit as an SE-5C8895, flown by one Major W. Sholto Douglas, CO of 84 Squadron. Do you have any information about this incident?
Well, actually, I have information, and I'm just looking up in my book about another balloon that my father was supposed to have shot down. And again, once again, it's in my book. And the thing is, he shot down the commander of the balloon wing, supposedly. But actually, he didn't. I can't remember the man's name. It's in my book. But yes, he was supposed to have shot down the commander of the balloon wing, who was exceptionally upset, obviously, and had to be hospitalized following this. I think the man's name was McNeice, but I'm not sure. And the thing was that Sholto was accused, but he reckoned just before the incident, there was a German aircraft sneaking over no man's land, and he reckoned that it was the German aircraft that shot down the balloon and not him. I mean, in one sense, he would say that, wouldn't he? But he chased the German aircraft back over the lines, over the enemy lines, but um, he couldn't find the aircraft. But he was under the impression that it was not him. this German aircraft. He actually went to see. I'm sure the man's name was McNeice, but he went to see McNeice in hospital, and not unnaturally, McNeice was extremely angry with him. But then they worked together later in the Air Ministry between the wars, and McNeice sort of forgave Sholto. So I haven't heard about Robinson, but I've heard about this other guy that he was supposed to have shot down, who was the commander of the balloon wing and was extremely upset.
Yeah, it'd be rough.
Oh, yes. McNeice, Lieutenant Colonel W.F. McNeice. Yes, that was the man. I have got it right.
Excellent. It'd be rather unfortunate if he was making a habit of shooting down
Well,
balloons, wouldn't
I
it?
don't know about this other guy. I'm interested.
It is interesting, yeah. Okay, we've got I think more of a sort of comment, I think, but it's an interesting one again from Sally, who correctly pointed out earlier. Sally, you should be working on your dissertation. What are you doing? I hope you enjoyed the lecture and the distraction anyway. So Sally says it's a very interesting lecture given the current pushback from the Ministry of Defence regarding personnel involved in IED events, and this came in during that period when you were mentioning the sort of IED classifications. Having to provide evidence themselves of TBIs. A number of ongoing cases are in progress. Also, the post-event 5-6 years ago of PTSD, and there's an RAF helicopter pilot friend who has an ongoing investigation, which the MOD stated as being moral injury, and she's going to steer him towards this sort of classification you've provided. And I do think it's very interesting to see that use of sort of moral injury and I think we often sort of underplay the effect it has on people in high command. And you see that sort of numerous from different wars. For instance, we think of the First World War with Haig, Dowding during the Battle of Britain. This must take a real toll on people in higher command.
I'm sure it does. In fact, I think it finished off Cyril Newell, because in 1940, he was what my father said was that he'd served in World War I, obviously, and what my father said in World War II in 1940 was that he was an absolute bag of nerves, to the extent that my father had to take on the role of Chief of the Air Staff as well as his own role, because Newell effectively stopped functioning. And I think that some of that was due to moral injury.
Yeah, I think his time as sort of deputy to the CAS is really interesting, because I think we often don't get a good sense of what Sholto's own view about air power involved. He's not one of the ones who comes out and really states his strategic beliefs. He clearly has the idea that air power is offensive. He uses it in that way everywhere he goes. But yeah, he does seem to be a very good manager. I had this conversation with a researcher earlier about Sholto. Seems to be a great manager, but it's much harder to parse out what he believes the sort of strategic importance of air power is. I mean, have you seen anything where you'd say, this is a great sort of definition of what he thought of air power and its strategic role?
Not really. But what I do think is that one exceptionally good summary that he wrote just before he took over Fighter Command, he wrote a summary about night fighting. And it really, and he said, absolutely, I can give you the document number, Harry, actually, a bit later on, but he absolutely delineated what he thought should happen and what his views were and what he needed to do the job. And the other thing is that I came across recently a YouTube clip of him and Coastal Command when he was C&C Coastal Command, and he talks about the victory of air power. And so that he does explain a little bit more about air power in that YouTube clip. I can forward that to you, actually.
I'd love it if you did. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Having sort of thought about it a little bit as sort of preparing for hosting this lecture, I think he is just a fascinating character, partly because he's hard to pin down, but you can see his sort of fingerprints on so many things when he was sort of working with the Chief of the Air Staff. So it's definitely an important area. And yeah, I think the fact that Trenchard sort of pulls him back in clearly shows he has very, he must have been able to advocate a clear vision of air power for Trenchard to have brought
Yeah,
him back in the way he did.
yeah. I think in World War One, it was largely to do with formation flying. That, he saw that in that situation, large formations really stemmed pilot losses and obtained victory over the Germans, over the German Air Force. Oh, I'm just going to write down now, actually, a YouTube coastal. And he does talk about air power in that clip.
Excellent. No, I think it's very interesting. One of the things that came to me, there's a really good question, which unless we get some more on, I'm going to end on. So, Alan, don't feel I'm not going to ask your question. I'm going to. But one of the things that I was picking up on as you finished is around his time in the occupation, is how he cooperated with allies. And I wondered, are there any sort of trends both during the war and into that occupation period about how he worked with multinational organizations, thinking about how he got on with the Americans, the French, and Commonwealth forces as well?
Yeah, now the big thing is the Americans during his time as CNC Middle East Command. Because I didn't actually put it in my presentation because there was actually so much to talk about, it's overwhelming. But there was a huge row between Churchill and Roosevelt. And this is really, really interesting because we've just had the anniversary of the partition of India. Now, the thing is that there was this big row because Churchill, Brooke, Alan Brooke, who was a friend of Sholto's, and others wanted Sholto to be appointed to the Supreme Command of Southeast Asia, SEAC. And the Americans said no. And Roosevelt said no. And there were various generals, American generals, who didn't want him to be appointed to that role. And Churchill was furious, and Brooke was furious because they wanted him appointed. They thought he was the best person. And Churchill said, if you can't provide me with a good reason, I want an inquiry about this. And that was in the middle of a world war. But actually, with people on the ground, he'd made some unfavourable remarks, Sholto had, about Americans and their strategy and tactics and about the supplies during various sort of meetings with Americans, or, actually it came down to parties, and he'd sort of had a bit too much to drink and made tactless remarks about Americans. But the thing was, the people who worked with him on the ground, Brereton and others, and I have the proof of the letter and it's in my book, Brereton really liked working with him. And, their views chimed, and he worked with them, with particularly Brereton, very well when he was out in the Middle East. And even Eisenhower actually praised him. And I have a book, I have Eisenhower's book. And he wrote, and it's there with Eisenhower's signature saying, to Sholto Douglas, outstanding airman of World War II. So Eisenhower did actually respect him. But the thing about him not getting the SEAC job, I think partly was that they were aware of his left of centre views. And of course, at that time, they were scared rigid about communism in Southeast Asia. So that could have been a factor. But the thing is, Mountbatten was appointed to SEAC, and he then became Viceroy of India, and the last Viceroy. And the thing is, I'm going to be very controversial now, but I'm going to say this anyway, is that if Sholto had been made Supreme Commander of SEAC, he would have probably, or he might have got the Viceroy post. And I have to say that I don't think he would have handled it in the way that Mountbatten did. Sorry to say that, it's very controversial. But, looking at these programs about partition, I've been thinking a lot about that, because in many ways it was a total disaster. And the rapidity with which it happened was appalling, and the loss of life was appalling. I don't think my father would have handled it in the same way. I have to say that.
No, I think that's a fair point. Mountbatten really does expedite the partition and
Oh, awful.
withdrawal from.
Yeah, terrible.
Okay, so we've got 2 more questions we're going to end on, and as I promised you, Alan, yours is going to be the last. So Brian asks, were you aware that in 1939 Douglas advocated for the offensive patrol by turret fighters? Of course, he wasn't alone in sort of thinking
Yeah.
the turret fighter might be the answer, but do we have a sort of sense that he quickly changed his mind, or was he?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did, and there's a document about that. He actually admits that turret fighters were a clumsy way of doing things. They were heavy, they were inefficient, and he said that and again, it's in my book. He said that the Spitfire and Hurricane were much better, but of course, at that point they were still waiting for them to come online. But yes, he could be criticised for that, but actually, in I think it may have been in the same document in which he advocated turret fighters, he also said, yes, but these are not the best option. So he was well aware of that.
Okay, brilliant. And so that brings us to our last question. You've waited patiently, Alan. Here it is. So one of the criticisms of Sholto is that he somewhat hoarded Spitfires in fighter command during 1942,
Yes.
when they might have been better used elsewhere.
Yes.
And he's thinking, for instance, in North Africa as well as in the Far East. Now,
Yes.
he asks, in particular, is that hoarding a feature of PTSD, or do we just think this comes into that sort of command decision structure?
I think it actually links in with what Stephen Bungay wrote in his review. I'm sure Alan has read Stephen Bungay's review of my book, which was a wonderful review, and I'm big thanks to Stephen. But the thing is, I do think it is something to do with PTSD, because the language, as Stephen points out, the language that he uses is not entirely rational. He says he's worried and he is scared. I sort of think, although Sholto would never put it like this because he wasn't that kind of man, I think he was scared, rigid, that the Luftwaffe was going to come across again and they were going to have huge losses. I think that was always at the back of his mind. And he was so worried about squadrons going to the Middle East because he was worried that he would not be able to face the situation if the Luftwaffe mounted an offensive like they had done in 1940. I think that's what he was worried about. I don't think it was entirely rational, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, brilliant. I've really enjoyed listening to you speak. I've enjoyed seeing your book as well. So I'd encourage everyone who's been here today and heard you talk to go and purchase a copy, because it's well worth getting hold of. But all that's really left for me to do is to thank our audience for joining us today, and to thank you, Katharine, for what's been a brilliant lecture. So thank you very much.
Thank you. One thing, I see a whole row of comments down the side. Am I able to see those comments afterwards?
You can. Yep, the comments will still be there. Some of them are me just showing the text from the bottom of the screen, which a lot of the time you covered anyway, but sort of proactively making sure people could see it if they needed to. But yes, there's been some lovely comments throughout the entire session. So it's really lovely. And can I say to the audience, it's always lovely to see that you've enjoyed the sessions. So thanks for posting that, because it means I can say to our managers, look, they're having an effect. They are appreciated. So yes, it's lovely to see. So yeah, thank you again, Katharine. And hopefully I will see you soon and hear from you soon. And hopefully I will see all of our audience soon, if not at our next event on the 5th and 6th of September. So see you then. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to Harry. Thanks.